This week, Harvard President Claudine Gay resigned amid plagiarism accusations and her inability to answer what many saw as a simple question during a recent congressional testimony. The question was, quote, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's code of conduct policies? She stated rather strangely that it depends on the context. Now, anti Semitism is not a new phenomenon, nor is it new in the world of academia, and it certainly isn't exclusive to the United States. So, we at the News Forum decided to ask that very question to the university presidents of Canada's top 40 universities. 12 universities responded, with most of them clearly stating that not only would it violate their policies, it would also likely be criminal hate speech and that the police would need to be involved. However, 28 universities did not, and they declined to comment. Joining us now to discuss anti Semitism on university campuses and more generally in Canada is Anthony Housefather, Member of Parliament for Mount Royal. Mr. Housefather, thank you very much for joining us on Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been very outspoken on this. It seems like it would be a rather simple question to answer, and yet Harvard's president and even university presidents in our own country, for them, it isn't that simple. Why do you think that is?
I honestly don't understand that. As you stated before, in Canada, that would be considered hate speech. And even if it doesn't rise to the criminal level, it certainly is speech that in any context is unacceptable on a university campus, where there is a right to, go to a level of conduct that goes beyond what is criminal hate speech. So the testimony of the presidents of Penn, MIT, and Harvard before the US Congressional Committee was shocking, which is why I and four of my liberal colleagues wrote also to the largest universities in Canada. We went to the 36 largest, not the 40 largest, to ask them the same question and ask them a number of other questions about how they're handling anti-Semitism on campus, with the goal of depositing those before the Justice Committee, which I hope will undertake a study on anti-Semitism in Canada, including anti-Semitism on campus, when we get back in January.
Yeah, you mentioned you also reached out to those universities. Can you share with us if they responded to you and what do you make of their responses?
So we gave them until the 20th of January. So I think I would be remiss if I started saying who's responded and who hasn't. But at the 20th of January, when the deadline comes, we intend to table with the Justice Committee all of the responses we have received. And certainly, are we to receive responses that don't unequivocally say that the call for genocide against Jews is something that would be impermissible on their campus, regardless of context? Those would be the type of presidents that I would like to see appear before the Justice Committee when we do our hearings.
And building on that, you stood in Parliament and said one of the most hostile places for Jews is on university campuses. Why are universities such hotbeds for anti-Semitism?
Well, one of the things that has struck me the most is the number of students from across the country who are either Jewish or strongly support Israel that have felt ostracized on campus since the 7th of October. They are forced often to walk through demonstrations in the middle of campus, screaming things like "from the river to the sea" or "Intifada, Intifada," which most members of the Canadian Jewish community would see as calls for the destruction of Israel, but also for the murder of civilians, including Jewish civilians outside of Israel. And so whether or not that rises to a level of hate speech is one question. I don't think it probably does, because they could argue the ambiguity of the phrase, but it certainly is conduct that somebody shouldn't have to walk through to get to class on university campus. Other students have talked to me about being attacked simply because they were wearing a Magen David or a kippah or other symbols of being Jewish, or a sweatshirt that said Israel on it. And others have talked to me about professors who clearly in class tell people that they can get credit to go to rallies for Palestine, but wouldn't offer the same for people to go to rallies for Israel, which again is a treatment that is systemically different between political causes, which is not permissible in a university setting. So I've been very distraught to hear that both students, faculty, and Jewish staff members at the university have been complaining, and that they feel that the administration of those universities has not taken it seriously, and that there's a feeling that anti Semitism on the campuses is treated differently than other forms of hate on campus.
Yeah, and it furthers the point on maybe the necessity of some sort of hearing to address that with the presidents of those universities. And so we'll certainly wait for those responses. We're about to go to break. When we come back, we'll shift gears to anti-Semitism more generally across the country. So stay with us. We'll be right back with Anthony Housefather. We're back on Forum Daily with Member of Parliament Anthony Housefather. I want to look at anti-Semitism more broadly in the country. We've seen Jewish community centers shot at, Jewish businesses vandalized, and most recently a Jewish deli set on fire. For a country that prides itself on being diligent, on fighting hate, we seem to be seriously backsliding. What do you make of this backsliding?
Well, the first thing is this phenomenon is happening across the world. It's not unique to Canada. Unfortunately, Jewish communities across the world, including in countries like Canada, the United States, and Australia, where we've traditionally been far safer and far more secure, are seeing these events happening, which are of great concern. And I think the biggest level of concern is the feeling amongst Jewish Canadians that all levels of government are not tackling this with the seriousness to be tackled, and that police are not treating this with the seriousness that we feel that it ought to be treated with. They've done a good job in terms of protecting Jewish community institutions generally. They're doing their best with limited resources, but these municipal police forces are often allowing demonstrations to occur right outside Jewish neighborhoods on a repeated basis where there's no logic for the demonstration to be there if the question is protesting Israel because there's no Israeli institution that's there. They're doing it right outside Jewish neighborhoods, Jewish businesses, Jewish community centers. And again, the speech that is coming out of those is deeply disturbing. So, what I think Jews are wondering is at what level are these protests going to disintegrate into? At what level are the threats to Jewish businesses, Jewish
Mm.
schools, going to disintegrate into before action is concretely taken?
I want to touch on your point there about Jewish Canadians and the difference between Jewish Canadians and the Israeli government. Because obviously, a lot of these incidents are in response to Israel's war against Hamas, and there may be valid criticisms about how the IDF is conducting itself in Gaza. But there seems to be this serious disconnect where criticism of the Israeli government and anti Jewish hate merge together and they
Yeah.
become indistinguishable. Why is this happening? Why are protesters or those who support Palestine in many of these instances failing to see that Jewish Canadians are not the government of Israel?
Oh, exactly. In the same way that nobody in Canada controls the terrorist group Hamas in Gaza, and you can't blame Palestinian Canadians or other Arab Canadians for the actions of Hamas, whether or not the vast majority of Jewish Canadians support Israel, which we do, it is our ancestral homeland. We are indigenous to Israel, and Jewish Canadians have a great attachment and affection for Israel. But we don't control the actions of the government of Israel. Many of us have validly criticized actions of the Netanyahu government.
Mhm.
We've criticized the comments of Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are right wing ministers in the government. But we are not responsible, whether we support Israel or not, for actions by Israel. And targeting our community, our institutions, stores that we own is just unacceptable. It is anti Semitic hate. And the fact that so many people seem unable to distinguish between Canada's Jewish community and the actions of a state in the Middle East is deeply distressing.
Uh, you mentioned law enforcement and the role they have to play here. Is this a resource issue, or is this just simply applying the law in a consistent basis?
I believe it's applying the law on a consistent basis, and it is possible that there are resources required, in which case, both police force and the Montreal police force can ask their provinces for additional help and additional resources. I am not aware of any such request having been made by either the mayor of Montreal or the mayor of Toronto. And so this is something that is deeply disturbing. If indeed it is a resource issue, it can be fixed by a request to the province for
Yeah.
additional help, And then the province can also request that for the federal government as well, if that, if that is further required. None of that has happened. And people seem to misdirect their anger to either the prime minister or provincial premiers when the vast majority of these demonstrations are happening in municipalities where the police are accountable to the mayor and local councils. And there has to be a clear message to me from the mayors, from the local councils, that they want police to enforce the law unambiguously, clearly, and
Mhm.
then police actually have to do so and have to make the request if they don't have the resources to do that.
Uh, Anthony, I really appreciate your time today. I hope that this situation does not get to a point where it gets far uglier and that level of police intervention becomes an absolute necessity before people get seriously harmed. But thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, David.